Welcome to the Boom Clap podcast, where culture and conviction collide. We are happy to be back with you guys recording these last few weeks, being back in your, cars, homes, wherever you're listening to us. It feels great, and we hope that you're enjoying us being back with you as much as we are enjoying being back with you. But that's a lot of back with you. But anyway, we're really happy. And this week we have a really great episode. An old favorite, Katy Faust, is back with us. Super excited for you guys to hear this episode. It was great to talk with her. She always brings a lot of energy, and it was no different today. Lots of energy around her new book, Pro-Child Politics: Why Every Cultural, Economic, National Issue is a Matter of Justice for Children. If you guys aren't familiar with Katy yet, she's the founder and president of Them Before Us, which is a global movement defending children's rights to their mother and father. She publishes on this topic and then testifies widely about this topic. And so this book really is different in the fact that there are several people writing to the topic, but it still surrounds the fact that of children needing justice, and all of the things that happen within politics, all the things that happen within legislation should anchor back to the topic of child justice, essentially, right?
Yeah, this conversation, you guys, is truly excellent. And honestly, I get off most of our episodes and think that, because wouldn't it be silly if we were producing these episodes that were not valuable, right? But this one, it just starts off with a bang, like just immediately. A boom, and then a clap. But it's sustained through the entire episode. Like, it is just chock full of truth and wisdom and passion. So I think you guys are going to love this one.
Yeah. So she takes a topic that she is familiar with, but then all of the things happening in America and Canada, this is happening all over the place.
Absolutely.
And pulls it back to that perspective of children and what is right for children, which is really good. And I got it, but at the end, she explained it in a little bit different way, why that matters. So make sure you listen to the end. And then there's some actionable steps that Cecily laid out that were from the book also that are really good. So, excited for this episode, excited for what's to come. Next week, we're going to be talking with you, just Cecily and I, back and forth, just old times, just what's on our mind. I think we're going to talk a little bit about homeschooling and some of the things that are going on in our lives. And then we have another good episode the following week about phone usage, which is apparently a problem in everyone's life. We found out that 91% of people are on their or with their phone 24 hours a day, which is incredible. So we have some really good stuff coming for you. Please, if you haven't, leave us a review. Go and just click the 5-star button wherever you listen, or you can leave written reviews on Apple, which really help us, broaden our listenership. So we would appreciate if you do that. Share the episodes with friends. It's always helpful to us. So anyway, without further ado, let's get into this episode with Katy.
Hey everyone, it's Cecily. We just wanted to give a quick precursor to this great interview with Katy Faust. You are used to our interviews being very easy for the whole family to listen along, but this might be one episode that you want to pre-listen to the content before playing it out loud in front of your kids, as there is definitely some sensitive subject matter. Enjoy the episode.
It's that time of year where everybody's starting to think about fall and making their homes cozy. And one of the best ways that I know women these days think about making their homes feel cozy and fall-like is with scents of pumpkin spice. And not all of those scents are healthy to be breathing in, healthy to be putting on your skin, but Ro Casa does offer a pumpkin spice line you can feel good about. They are back with their hand cleaner, their lotions, their candles that are all pumpkin spice scent and perfect for the fall season. So go to rocasaorganics.com and use the code BOOMCLAP to save 20% off your order. All right, guys, we have Katy Faust with us back today. Hey, Katy, we are so happy to have you for the third time on with us. Excited.
It's such a joy to be here. You guys are like my favorites, so I really appreciate you making the time.
We appreciate that. We appreciate the conversation we had with you before. It feels like recording with a friend at this point. Like
Absolutely.
You're no longer just a guest on our podcast. You're a friend, and I love your fire. I love when you come on, you bring the heat, and I don't know. That's great.
Well, there is a lot of heat to be generated these days. I mean, like every single thing that matters in life needs to be like defined, defended. And we all need to kind of start doing that. Like I listen to so many podcasts about so many different things. I'm like, where is there thriving and wholeness and health? Very, very few places, very few governments, very few regions, very few areas of politics. I mean, every now and then you can find, a little community that's doing it right, or one family that's really doing it well. But overall, there's very few areas of life where I'm like, yeah, awesome. That sector is doing it exactly right. And so I think more fire for more of us in more places is probably what we need, both in terms of like ensuring our own children's like thriving, but also like national thriving too.
Yeah.
It's so interesting you say that. Like you say, everything needs to be kind of be defined and defended right now. I find from a Christian perspective, I'm feeling it really, really acutely right now, kind of like the early COVID time. I'm feeling the same things acutely right now, as far as Christians are very much saying, yes, truth, but keep your focus only on the gospel and sharing the love of Jesus. And yes, I totally am all for that. But it's so funny because people are saying Christians should be involved in politics. They will acknowledge that Christians should be involved in politics. There's nothing wrong with Christian politicians, etc. But when people, like average people like me, talk about politics, it's like, well, why are you doing that? Because we should just focus on the love of Jesus and spreading the gospel. And so it's like, well, which is it? Which is it? Is it only certain people are okay to talk about politics from a Christian perspective, but others aren't? Or is it everybody? You know what I mean? Like I'm finding there's this real tension right now. And I'm like, I don't see the logic in it. And I can't find my place in it according to that prescription that I'm being told about.
Yeah. And it's such a fallacy because number one, everybody has a worldview. It's not like there's a neutral worldview out there and then there's a Christian worldview. Like if you are like subscribed to like the highly progressive worldview, it doesn't mean you're secular. It means you are pushing an alternative worldview that is very religious in nature in a lot of ways. And then you can have the critique of, well, you conservatives, right? Shouldn't be talking about this, you Christian conservatives. But then if you actually look at the numbers, like liberal Christians, progressive Christians are actually twice as likely to have like conversations about this, be engaged in politics. Like they've actually rated the number of like sermons of times where the pastors are going to mention something political, and it like the left Christians are much more likely to talk about politics. So this idea of just focus on the gospel, love people, like obviously you don't want conversations about politics absent of the Christian worldview. But I will tell you, like the things that concern me, Dennis Prager put his finger on this, 10 years ago. He said there's two threats to our to our Western civilization is probably what he said. The two main rival worldviews that are going to destroy the Western civilization is radical Islam and progressivism, right? What we now kind of look at as like the woke worldview. And now, as we can see, because I follow a lot of the news in Europe and listen to a lot of podcasts in the UK, and like, you really do see a clash of civilizations going on with both of those competing for hegemony, right? In terms of how we think about culture, technology, law, entertainment, academia. And you don't triumph against either of those competing worldviews by being silent or bowing and scraping or apologizing. It's not enough even to just refute radical Islam or progressivism. You actually have to replace it with something better. And do you know what the something better is? It is Christ. But the Christ is not one that is just stays in our churches and stays in our own homes and our own mouths and our own prayers. It is a Christ that explains the world through the Christian worldview. It is a Christ that takes those truths into every area of politics and life. And you know what? That is really, really good for our neighbor. When you have a worldview and a politics that is absent of those critical biblical principles, you are going to have a society with more injustice, more inequality. You're going to have a society with more crime, right? More economic depression, right? Every area of life is actually going to be affected if we do not take our biblical principles into the world. So this whole like, oh, you should just sit down, you should be quiet, this isn't for you, just love people. Politics is a way that we love people. And we actually are in an incredibly privileged position because, I mean, a lot of people say, well, look at the first century church. I mean, they weren't doing politics. They were just like rescuing the orphans and, trying to feed the poor. Yeah, that's really good. First century Christians didn't have voting power. They couldn't run for office. I mean, we have such privileges to make incredible change in politics now. And if you are not holding on to those God-given and constitutionally given levers, you really are forsaking a huge area of responsibility that God has handed to you on a silver platter. And you're saying, I'm not going to pull those levers. I'm going to allow people that have worldviews that are going to demonstrably be more harmful to, especially the most vulnerable, they can have it instead.
Okay. Thank you.
Yes.
This is why the very first time we had you on our podcast, I said to you, could you run for president? Like, could you? Oh. I still feel the same, Katy. And you said like, one of the reasons that we fight in a way for our worldview is because it's good for our neighbor. And I remember saying that Rita and I both said that so much during those COVID years, especially. It's like, we're not just doing this for ourselves. We're fighting because this is better for our neighbor as well. We are loving our neighbor through this, even though someone might be looking at it and think, what you're saying is, quote, unloving. Like, I disagree strongly because I actually believe that by pointing people to truth, and I think we did it with as much grace as possible. In fact, that we are being loving and we're seeking to bring justice, right? So what would you say, because this is something else I hear, what would you say to the Christian that says, it's okay, essentially? Not that it's great, but I'm trying to think how I can say this exactly, but they'll point to the fact that the church is growing faster than ever in persecuted places and say, the Christian church grows better than ever. And maybe that's the way to bring revival to the West. What would you say to the Christian that says, settle down, kind of let it happen because that's the way to revival? What would you say to that?
Well, a couple things. It is true that Christians tend to grow under persecution, but there are also situations where Christians have been wiped out through persecution. I mean, there's Christian, there's a lot of places where Christianity has been absolutely ground down to nothing because of persecution. So it's not like persecution is this unmitigated good for the church. Will the church triumph? Will the gates of hell overcome? No, it won't. But I don't think that we should over romanticize persecution in terms of like, A, over romanticize it, B, go along as if you don't have to stand up and fight, because these principles that we fight for. Okay, so that's number one. Persecution is not always good. But I can say, we have raised our kids in Seattle. I would say that we are a couple decades ahead of the rest of the country in terms of having it be a hostile environment for Christians. Some legitimate areas of persecution, some just uncomfortable areas. And I will say that there is a refining aspect to it. You do figure out, what am I willing to speak up on? Am I willing to prioritize Christ above approval, above my job, above getting into the gym when, they say I have to have this passport or whatever? Am I willing to really equip my kids to stand against this? And so there is a refining power of that. But that does not necessarily mean that you then need to withdraw, right? Because these principles really are, like you said, good for everybody. And here's the other thing. Defense of the most vulnerable, especially children, is and always has been a marker of true Christianity. So this idea that you can opt out of the cultural and political conversations that are very obviously victimizing children, in my opinion, it is one of the most anti-Christian things that you can do. Yeah. You go back and you see wherever Christianity went throughout the world, children were dignified and protected. In the first century alone, you actually saw abortion, infanticide, child genital mutilation in the name of turning these children into eunuchs so they could be, servants in wealthy households, highly sexualized relationships, whether it was just something that the children saw or using them as sexual objects, we're actually seeing a return of so many of the pagan practices today that Christianity stamped out because it thought about children differently. It protected children differently. It had rules about sexuality that guarded children against the kind of predatory behavior that they had been rampantly exposed to all throughout the Roman world. And so why is it? I mean, the way that children were approached and the way that children were dignified by Christianity was so radically different from the culture that the church was born into that many sociologists actually posit that Christianity invented childhood, that there wasn't no such thing as this dignifying, this is a human made in the image of God, they deserve protection, picture of children. They deserve to have a childhood where they're not just used, abused, sold, mutilated, destroyed based on the powerful. That a lot of people, a lot of sociologists would say childhood as a category didn't exist before Christianity. That is the kind of impact that Christianity has had, working through cultural influences for sure, but then also enshrining a lot of that into law in terms of like no child marriage, right? No incest, ensuring that marital relationships were only between a husband and wife and outlawing premarital sex, extramarital sex, all other kinds of pederasty, where children were being used, as outlets for, as common as some men would masturbate these days. And so we enshrined a lot of those child dignifying, child protections into law when we had the cultural levers to do so. So I would say that in all of the different areas of politics right now, you can see it the most starkly in cultural issues, but really you can take that into all areas of politics. You, the Christian, you are the shield for children. And if you choose to opt out of those political decisions, I would say it's not because you're doing it based on biblical principle. Be honest with yourself and saying you're doing it because of social acceptance.
Yeah.
Well said.
I want to pull out one thing you said towards the beginning there, that when people say that, look at what people historically did, like they didn't really talk about politics. They were just doing all these things, caring for people, talking about the gospel. You mentioned we have to look at what was also going on historically, what rights they had and what their government was like and what ours is like now. You can't leave that out. And I think that's left out of most of the conversations. One, two, our last episode, this is kind of a rebuttal. So we had done a Q&A on Christian topics with a pastor. And one of them was one of our guests asked a question, how does a Christian vote for the progressive movement? How does a Christian vote Democrat at this point? And I basically gave the answer. I was like, I can't give you a good answer. I don't understand it. It does not make sense at this point in time. But he had mentioned whenever you mix religion and politics, the only thing that you get at the end of it is politics. And so this is somewhat of a good rebuttal to that question and answer we had there on that last episode.
Super appreciated the conversation with him, but I think it was
absolutely.
in the book, actually, in your book, Pro-Child Politics. I forget which, because your book was super interesting, the way it was different authors on different topics. We'll talk about that. But someone had said, this isn't politics. It has become politics, but it's actually moral issues.
Right?
That's
right. And I would say that he's right, that if your politics is God, if that is the highest value in your life, if being a conservative or being a progressive is the most important thing, if it's the top of your hierarchy of values, if you want to use Jordan Peterson's speak, of course, whatever's at the top is going to influence everything below it. So the challenge for Christians is to make sure that conservatism isn't at the top, or progressivism isn't at the top, or environmentalism is not at the top. Christ is at the top.
Yes. Yeah.
But he will and he should influence everything that falls under, that primary hierarchy. You could call that a God. Whatever it is that you value the most is your God. Whether or not it looks like a deity, but if environmentalism is the highest value, it is going to influence your choices, your behavior, and your doctrine. So you keep Christ at the top, and he will, and he should influence everything else, your choices, your behavior, your word, your relationships, and your political, leanings and actions as well.
100%. Just literally had this conversation with my dad yesterday when he was here. I was like, I think that sometimes people are putting conservatism before Christianity, and then we're coming out with problems on that side too. So anyway, very good. Very, very good.
So you said like Christ should filter down into all those categories. Absolutely. And that's why this book that you wrote and edited is so amazing, because it does exactly that. It walks people through it in a very structured and organized way, which I really appreciated. Like, I read the first chapter and I was like, okay, I think this is going to be the structure of the whole book. And that makes it so easy for my brain. So let's talk about it a second here. I'm just going to bring it up and I want to go through the contents. So the book is called Pro-Child Politics: Why Every Cultural, Economic, and National Issue is a Matter of Justice for Children. So you've broken it up into 3 main sections, which is cultural, economic, and national. So like I said, just so smart. Under the cultural section, I'm going to read through all the headings just because I want people to get an idea for what's all included. So cultural, we have the subtopics there. The chapters are life, masculinity, femininity, family, race, gender ideology, and pornography. I read through that first section when I was on vacation, I guess we were visiting family on Vancouver Island. And I read through that first section in like the first half day that we were there. And I was like to my husband, I'm like, you need to read this. Like, it's just so well done. And then second section is economic. The chapters under that are the economy, taxes, debt, energy, ESG, and DEI. And then the third and final section is national, which covers religious liberty, education, digital technology, the environment, foreign policy, policing, border security, and immigration. So all of these topics that a lot of people are like, ooh, and you guys just went there and you found, like, the way the book was formatted is that you had different authors that kind of like specialize in each area, which was really cool because I would say the whole book kind of had your tone through it as far as it was extremely bold, but we still had all of these different personalities and experiences, and every chapter kind of had a story near the beginning to kind of anchor their point. And it was just really well done. So pro-child politics, tell us, like, what does it mean, first of all, to be pro-child from your perspective?
Yeah. You know, when I go speak and when I write articles and things like that, I often talk about how if you prioritize to children, if you put their rights and their needs first, you actually would get great policy. And I've done a lot of work on the social issues, you know, all those things in the first chapter. Family obviously is a huge aspect of what we do at Them Before Us, but we get into the life issues as well. That leads into talking about masculinity and femininity. Obviously, I've done a lot of work, you know, even developed curriculum around like pornography and, you know, teaching teens about that and casual sex. And I haven't done as much about race, but definitely followed it. Have done a lot of writing, like guest authored chapters on transgenderism. And so like, that was not as new to me as a lot of the other areas, but I also don't think that I'm like the top expert on any one of those. And so, and then you get into the economic issues and the national issues, and I'm like, I like, if I had to write the border security one, I mean, it would take me a year to just know enough to be able to like frame this in 3,000 words. And so what we did is we said, okay, let's do, you know, what we do on social issues, which is put kids first. What would things look like in your personal life and in politics if you put kid first, if you prioritize their rights, their needs, you know, their future? What would that look like? And then we said, what if we did that on everything? What if we just did that on every political issue? And obviously, I'm not the right person to write on debt or policing. So we found the people that were already experts on the subject. And then I said, can you explain your issue in 3,000 words through the Them Before Us lens, through the lens of put children first? And it is jaw-dropping. It's incredible to me. And I actually had somebody, I was talking with this project with somebody that had been in the publishing world for like 25 years. And she said, I wouldn't do this if I were you. She's like, these projects typically don't work out very well when you have this many authors with that many different voices and this many different topics covered in such, I mean, it's too expansive. It's just going to be a collection of essays. It's not going to be a book. And it's true that that there was a danger there. But what we did to solve it is we said, I'm going to give you a rubric that everybody must follow. There is no bending. You cannot go outside of this. And here's the rubric. The first one is you begin your chapter with the story of a real life child who was victimized because we got the economy wrong, or we got taxes wrong, or we got national security wrong, or we got education wrong. Give me that real life story of a child, because the other side, the progressive world, their whole movement is based on personal story. And even though they don't have natural law, they don't have good research, they don't have even like a cohesive thought process, they don't have common sense. They have transformed society based on personal narrative, you know? So I said, we have to play that game. And we can, because children really are victimized when we get these questions wrong. So I said, first of all, start with the real life story of a kid that was victimized. Then just give me the big lies. Give me the big lies about race. Give me the big lies about immigration. Give me the lies about ESG and DEI. And then tell me how those lies harm kids. Like, make it very, very practical. And then tell me the truth. What's the truth about policing? What's the truth about pornography? What's the truth about masculinity? And then tell me how kids would be protected if we executed those truths. And then the last section, I said, show me where it's worked. I don't want this to just be theory. Show me who has made changes to the economy in ways that serve kids. Show me the states that have overhauled education in ways where children are helped. And to me, that's the magic of the book is like, I have to go back and reread the taxes chapter or the foreign policy chapter, because I don't know a lot about it. But what we did is like, we've got these top level experts that boiled down very complex topics into 3,000 words that's actionable and digestible, where you can like I walk away from the national security chapter. I'm like, I got this. I know exactly, I understand this issue. So that's what I love is it's very accessible. And, you come to hear Abby Johnson's chapter on life, or Billboard Chris's chapter on transgenderism, or we got the Moms for Liberty co-founder, Tiffany Justice, to write the education chapter. Like, come because you love their writing, stay and become an expert on environmentalism from the guy that runs the American Conservative Coalition. Like it really is like a cheat for all of us to just know something about these issues that come up every election and that are always, at the forefront when we have political conversations.
It really felt like, it did not feel like a conglomeration of a bunch of voices. It felt very united. So how you sent out to people, like, this is what you have to follow. That makes so much sense now, because I'm like, how did you get everybody to sound so united? But it's also, I don't want to sound like I'm like, this is a bad thing. This is a good thing. It's like the Cliff's Notes version of all of the topics going on in culture, but in a way that is deep and you understand it and you can converse with it then when somebody comes at you about one of these topics. So I think, I don't know, I think you did a really great job.
Totally.
The Cliff Notes version, I'm going to just use that because that's true. That really is what it is. Like, you want to understand religious liberty and why it impacts kids? Here are the 3 big points. Here's the real life stories of kids that were harmed. Here's the truth. This is why it matters to kids. And here's how you implement policy that's going to protect religious liberty. And it really is, it's hard to get experts that have written books and books on this kind of thing to say, take your message, give me 3,000 words on it. But you get this highly, highly concentrated, and it's like the Cliff Notes. You get this highly concentrated snapshot of these really complex issues.
Concentrated. That's a good way to put it, because it's not diluted down in any way, shape, or form. It's amazing.
It's really good. You did such an excellent job. So every chapter was really great and important. And like you said, there were certain ones that I was like excited to read that I loved. And there were other ones that I didn't know that I would be excited to read until I started reading them. So there's a few chapters that just really stuck out. And I don't know if it's like the Holy Spirit, like directing me to things that he wants me to focus on for this next season or whatever. But the biggest gut punch for me, even though there were so many stories in there that were just incredibly heartbreaking, for some reason, the biggest gut punch was the chapter on pornography. Just the devastation and the heartbreak that this can wreak on people's lives. And I think it's because it is so accessible.
Yeah.
So, and just like Common Sense Media reports, 73% of teens have watched online porn. average age of exposure is age 12. And just the distorted view of sex and sexuality that it brings to these kids' lives. And it's not just for like this little moment in time. It tends to follow them. And that just like completely breaks my heart. And even to the point of like violent, like this part, and if you have children listening, just be cautious, but violent sex acts between and among kids. It said 33% of sexual assaults against children or teens is by other children or teens, usually precipitated by pornography. It's just awful. And the story that he led with, I think it was the story this person led with, was of a young Christian boy, like growing up in a Christian home and being exposed to pornography and just the struggle that plagued him. And it was just like, this absolutely can happen to anyone. So I don't know. I just want to talk about this one for a bit because like I said, it was a gut punch. It was a gut punch.
What I love about that chapter, so many things, but I think that a lot of us that did not grow up in the online world, we think about porn like Sports Illustrated swimsuit edition.
Right.
Or we think even just about like the videos that you would get, that tended to be like genuine sex acts, lots of nudity, lots of intercourse. That is not what porn is today. Porn is violent, demented. They weave in all kinds of very disturbing content. You have anime porn. You've got bestiality porn. You've got father-son porn. I mean, you have porn of every variety. And the problem with porn is when you watch something and you have a sexual response to it, you literally condition yourself to want it again. And so porn functions as a drug in the brains of especially adolescents and kids. It can be absolutely a gateway to things like homosexuality and transgenderism, not because you started out with same-sex attraction or gender confusion, but because once you watch porn with transgenderism featured or same-sex relationships taking place, you condition yourself to want that and act it out. And so porn is a very common feature of, the stories of gay men. And we already have documented cases, of pornographers saying, we want to use this to lure people into transgenderism, and people who are transgender saying, I got into this because of porn. But it's very, very sneaky. And it's just not like the porn that we thought of when we were kids, we being, I'm a Gen Xer, right? So I think that there's a lot of confusion around porn, A, just in terms of what it is, B, in terms of the impact that it has on especially kids, the way that it literally alters their brain structure. It is the most widely used drug in the United States today. And even if you had temporary exposure to it, when you saw a disturbing video when you were 12 or 13, cocaine will metabolize out of your system. Those images from porn will stay. I mean, men, that are 40, 50, 60, they'll still remember something that they saw when they were 14, 15, or 16, right? It's very hard to metabolize out the pornographic images that you put in. And the ubiquity, right? The accessibility of porn is so dangerous today. I mean, you've got a 10-year-old boy could see more pictures of naked women before he gets out of bed in the morning than most grown men throughout the world would see in their lifetime. I mean, it is a massive altering of not just the brain, but childhood itself. So what I love about that chapter that was authored by John Schweppe at the American Principles Project, which has really led the way in terms of shutting down porn in several states, is he talks about how there's been all of these false ideas about why we can't regulate porn and we shouldn't try to regulate porn. And this is just free speech. It's not. It's none of those things. And he talks about actually, here's the actions that we can take. And here's actually what we've done already. And it's so fascinating to me because the main thing that we need to fight porn is age verification laws. Just to say, hey, we just want you to verify that whoever's going on Pornhub is 18 or older. Right? We've pushed that in several states. The APP has. And it's so interesting because the porn industry, they have the ability to do age verifications and say, okay, we're only going to make sure that people over 18 are accessing Pornhub. And so they've passed laws in Utah and a couple other states saying you will mandate that you have age verification for your website. And rather than doing that, they leave. They would rather leave the state and not do business than verify that you're over 18. I mean, so it just reveals the porn industry as absolute predators. absolute grimmers, right? They would rather make a little extra money than protect kids. And so that's where we say, look, this is a matter of child protection. Pornography is a matter of child protection. There are things that we can and should do to protect kids against porn.
Okay, how does the age verification work?
Is
it like when you go on an alcohol website or something and it's like, are you 18 and older, and you can just put in a date?
Yeah.
Or
I'm sure that there are ways where you could fabricate and get around it, but I'm sure that they do require some level of actual ID that then you probably can use on different sites as well. But there needs to be some kind of verification, a literal ID that they have to check. And that's too much for them. I mean, they do it on like gaming websites. I mean, like the whole like betting on, online betting.
I don't know anything about that, but that makes sense.
No, it's not like you can't do it. It's easily used, but there's something about not capturing that under 18 demographic that pornography producers and distributors don't want to put up with for some reason.
Well, and that's just what's so telling about it, right? Like you can see the motivations, and if they're not willing to do something so simple, because it's not like it's debatable. Is porn good for kids? It's not debatable in any way. So when the facts clearly point to that and they're not willing to just be like, yeah, that's true. There's something seriously wrong with that. Seriously wrong with it.
Yeah. Thank you for telling me what chapter stood out to you, because this is brand new. I mean, like I just got a copy in the mail like yesterday. So it's like, I'm looking through it for the first time. Not a lot of people have even seen the digital copy. So I am really curious about what chapters kind of stand out to people. So thanks for sharing that.
Well, I mean, and maybe other people will have different ones. Like I said, I think it's going to be very individual for people. And like I said, maybe even like what the Holy Spirit is wanting to reveal to you in whatever season that you're in. But I think another extremely important chapter, and I know Rita is going to probably agree with this, is the ESG chapter.
Very much.
That was like one of my favorite chapters. And you would think, ESG, I mean, like whatever that's corporate, Microsoft is doing blah, 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 blah.
This is what I told Cecily. This is what I told her.
Yeah.
Like almost word for word. I said, people think ESG is boring, but they do not understand it is like the thing flying beneath the radar on all these issues, like pushing them and keeping them going.
Yeah.
Well, yeah.
I love that, what he said. And obviously there's so many chapters that layer on top of each other. And I love that because, you got the economy chapter and they're like, just read the debt chapter and you'll understand, but then, and obviously like the masculinity and femininity chapter draws a lot on the family chapter. And like, there is a lot of wonderful overlap, but the DEI chapter is like, this chapter affects everything else in this book. Everything else in this book stems from so many of the ideas from DEI and ESG.
100%. The author actually wrote, this is the conversation Rita and I were having last night was about this. And the author actually wrote in there, ESG is essentially upstream of every chapter in this book. And it's funny because before I even read that sentence and I was reading the rest of what he had written before that, I was like thinking that. I'm like, every other chapter in this book is connected and flows out of this. And that's like what people need to understand. So if they think these 3-letter words, which a lot of them are terrible and boring and awful, ESG, it's not a 3-letter word, it's an acronym, but it is something that you need to know about. Like, so can you tell for the people that don't know, what is ESG?
Yes.
Define the letters.
Yes. So I've got like my reading glasses on because I don't want to get any of this wrong. Let me just say that Justin Danhoff, who is one of the originators of Strive, which is Vivek Ramaswamy's organization. So I mean, like when I say I got the experts on all these topics, I got the experts on all these topics. I mean, like this guy has been deep in the world of seeing how these kinds of social, supposedly, environmental, social, and inclusive governance really impacts not just the business world, but the rest of the world as well. And Justin starts out with this story of a little girl in Sri Lanka, because Sri Lanka absolutely went all in on ESG and DEI. They're like, okay, we will take this environmental and social and inclusive principles, and we're just going to we're going to base our entire economy on it. Sri Lanka went from a functional country to absolute poverty and disarray. I mean, like that is what happens when you replace things like merit and efficiency and truth with ESG and DEI. And so, he outlines what are the lies about ESG. A lot of the ESG priorities are pushed in the name of helping kids. ESG helps kids, right? We want kids to have, a good environment, and we want them to be socially flourishing, and we want them to have great governance. Like, we want them to be governed well, right? This is for the kids. And I will say that is a very, very common thing in this book. Like, we are going to push reproductive technologies for the kids, right? We are going to, push gender transitions for the kids. Well, obviously education is for the kids. Oh, we need to tax you more for the kids. I mean, so much of almost every chapter in here, right? We need to reduce the level of police for the kids. And it's always all of these sort of progressive narratives that are often in the name of for the kids, harm kids. And he made that so clear in the opening story. So he talked about how ESG is in the name of helping kids, right? It's pushed. And then he talks about the sort of sleight of hand that happens within the ESG world that replaces shareholders with stakeholders, right? And so this idea that shareholders who actually have an interest in how Walmart is doing, or how Google is doing, or how, the little smaller startup that just launched, right? Those are the people that they have a stake in it. They actually want the business to do well. They want things to be efficient. They've swapped that out, which is historically how we've run business. They've swapped that out with stakeholders, right? Now it's not just the people that have a share in the company. Now everybody's a stakeholder. And it's just a way of saying, we're going to warp and transform this corporation into an arm of social transformation. And it's not social transformation towards the protection of children. It's social transformation towards a progressive world that is more and more disconnected from reality. So then he talks about how that harms kids. He goes through the E, the S, and the G, and talks about how it puts kids at risk. And then he gives the truth about ESG, which I just think it was just absolute fire, absolute fire. He says ESG targets kids. That's really what it does. Like the way that we advertise about it, the way that we work this into child programming. I mean, so much of what you're seeing in like Disney, it's ESG driven, right? All these ways that we're actually trying to co-opt kids, it's targeting kids. And then it says, the truth number 2 is ESG is poisoning all areas of our culture. And it's true, right? Setting this up as this is some kind of great good for kid. No, it's infecting and poisoning everything, every kind of institution, every sector of society. And then he's like, his last truth is like, you're funding it. You're funding ESG. The way that the economic systems are set up now, your mutual funds, you're funding it. Because you've got these big 3 organizations that run everybody's like money market account, and they all have these ESG, DEI priorities. So you look at what you're seeing out there and you're hating it and you're paying for it.
Yep. You're fully invested in it. And I think what's important to note too is that these values that ESG, DEI are advocating for, they're not just like popular ideas. They're not just like, oh, I feel this way, and so does this person, and now our ideas are making it out into the marketplace of ideas. It's being pushed by specific people. And then people are taking it on thinking like, oh, I guess that sounds like a good idea. Because even with Sri Lanka, it was the World Economic Forum and BlackRock that were actually pushing them towards this. And now they're living in poverty and hunger. And it's like, this wasn't even their idea. They just adopted the idea that was
economic chaos, social chaos. And kids pay the price, right? Anytime you don't have stability within society. Children are always going to pay the price.
Yeah. And despite the fact, I find this so interesting, there's total chaos there, yet their ESG score is almost perfect at 98.1. Wow. So it's like that in itself, it's like if you're only looking at that data, you're going to think everything's wonderful. But if you look at all of the data, you can see that actually maybe a high ESG score pairs with total chaos. Just like you see with a lot of Democrat and progressive-led movements. They're celebrating it as beautiful and loving and wonderful, but what comes with it, well, living in Seattle, total chaos, right?
I would say that is probably the thread that weaves its way through all these different chapters. Is you can listen to what progressives say about reproductive justice, or like tearing down the patriarchy, or socialist policies in, the economy, or protecting the earth, or taxing the rich. And all of it is awesome and amazing in ideology world.
Mm-hmm.
But once you actually touch grass, once you actually see what happens in real life when we implement these ideas, it is destruction, and that's it. Like ESG,
Mm-hmm.
Sri Lanka is doing it great.
Mm-hmm.
But what's the reality on the ground?
Yeah.
Total destruction,
Mm-hmm.
starvation,
Mm-hmm.
deprivation.
Well, again, from a Christian worldview, the Bible teaches us, examine the fruit, right?
Mm-hmm.
And for some reason, a lot of people are stopping short of actually examining the fruit that's coming off the tree,
Yeah, that's a good way to put it.
Yeah. Well, I think too, I just want to hammer home, like, pay attention to these things that seem a little annoying or a little boring to go through, because that's what's behind everything. I think we see a lot of people, getting enraged by the libs of TikTok videos or whatever. They'll watch these things and they'll be like, oh my gosh, look at what's happening in culture, but what's actually behind it?
Yeah.
What is going on underneath the surface is pushing these things out there, because truly these people that are falling for these traps of transgenderism and all of these things are being used by all of this underlying agenda like ESG that's being pushed, that's making these things come forward into our culture. Mm-hmm. And so get mad about that. Understand the ESG, understand the DEI, and get mad about that and try to do something there.
Well, that's just it. Like, don't stop at the rage. I think that's something that's so frustrating for us, even as having a platform with a podcast. It's like, unless we are just sharing quick bits of outrage, we have to really struggle. Right? Where it's like, but if we want people to understand the issues, but it's so much easier to just feel ragey about something for a second rather than like figure out like, well, help me understand it. And what can I do?
I think one thing so if I have my way, what this book is going to be is somebody or many people are going to hand this to leaders of the GOP and say, this is how we should message everything. Because what happens, as Molly Hemingway said in her blurb at the beginning, what happens when you prioritize kids is you get conservatism.
Right.
You get real, genuine conservatism. And I would say that protecting the next generation probably is the connective tissue that actually aligns all of the different aspects of conservatism, the social, the cultural, the foreign policy. Like, you find everybody under the same roof when you prioritize kids. And so, especially if you're operating on principle, which I'm not saying the GOP is these days, but they're closer to the truth than the progressives are, the Democrats are, that's for sure. But actually, if you prioritize kids, you get an outlet for the rage. Mm-hmm. You actually get an object that you can direct at, which is child protection. Yeah, of course, you should be just tearing your hair out about, the ways we've tried to defund the police, or the ways that we talk about women in terms of denigrating stay-at-home moms, or, the radical abortion policies, like laugh and point and sneer at the DNC who's rolling the the Planned Parenthood van that's rolling up to the DNC convention offering free vasectomies and abortion bill. Get angry about that.
Yeah.
But do you know what? There's real victims here. And it's always kids. It's always kids. So we are right to have that rage. Oh my gosh, you're kidding me. How dare you kind of feeling. But you have to turn that into action. And what kind of action do we need? In all of these different areas, the action is child protection. It's like, be frustrated about like the price controls that they want to talk for groceries, or the rent caps, that the progressives are pushing. But you need to get angry on behalf of kids, because it's kids who are going to pay the price when we turn into a socialist economy, which is really, several steps away, just a couple steps away from those kinds of economic decisions. So I think that there's a lot of ordinary Americans who rightly are like, oh my gosh, oh, you're kidding me. Take that, channel it towards child protection. And one of the goals of the book is to tell you exactly how to do that.
You live a wholesome lifestyle. The food you purchase, the influences on your family. Have you ever thought of the culture behind your bath and beauty products? Pure Innata is a cosmetic brand with values that align with yours. Everything from their ingredients and manufacturing processes to the mission behind their brand, it is all wholesome and lovely. Pure Innata was founded by a homeschool mom, Candace Grenier, almost 20 years ago. She became aware of the toxins in regular beauty products and wanted a healthier alternative to traditional cosmetics for herself and her family. Now her babies have all grown up and her adult children participate in their family business, producing the products in their certified lab on the Canadian prairies. They have everything from color cosmetics to naturally scented body care products. Their website offers inexpensive samples to try before you buy and free shipping across North America over $75. So go ahead and visit them at pureannata.ca to give them a try for yourself. Yeah, and it does. I mean, it really does. I like the way you said that if you could have it your way, you would get the book into the hands of the GOP. Because I really think, like, obviously the three of us come from a Christian worldview, but in the book, that's really not the focus. The focus is not the Christian worldview. It's protecting children, right? And so whether you are voting conservative because of a Christian worldview and the fact that it aligns with your values, or you're voting that way, Republican, I'm Canadian here, but it's the same idea, right? Whether you're voting that way because you are not a believer, but you are able to see the facts and the evidence pointing to the fact that the ideas on the left are leading to death and destruction. And the ideas, hopefully on the right, if we're doing it right, are leading to like the flourishing of children. And if that's happening, that means the rest of people are too, you know? So I really like that, because no matter what your worldview is, as Christianity or not, you should be able to look at the evidence that you see in front of you and take that.
This is a good, I would say, object lesson for what we were talking about at the beginning. Like, I am the biggest Bible thumper you are ever going to meet. Like, I carry my Bible around with me in the purse. I'm going to be on a flight, to Boise later today, and I'll read on this plane. And if the person next to me is open to it, I'll ask them to read with me too. I mean, like, I read the Bible with everybody, everyone that will let me. My husband was a pastor for 25 years. Now he's a Navy chaplain. I mean, like, we're down with Jesus. Like, we are into it. But the way that we manifest our convictions in policy is not by citing Bible verses. Yeah. It is by making the best arguments based on economic, biological, and historical reality. We do that for our kids. We do that for the policies that we're advancing as well. You don't have to say, well, this is what the Bible says, therefore I'm voting this way. You actually can look at the impact on the ground and say, this is best for children, for families, for social flourishing. Happens to line up with the Bible.
Exactly. And what a witness that is, right?
That's right. Yeah. So I think that there's some authors that might cite God or mention God here and there, but there's even the religious liberty chapter. It's not like, hey, protect Christianity. Right. It's like, actually, conscience rights are foundational to a healthy and thriving and tolerant society. So it's a little segue. I am on the advisory board for Jordan Peterson's new project, the Alliance for Responsible Citizenship. And we had our first conference last November in London. And another one of the advisory board members, Jonathan Pajot, was giving his speech. And he asked everybody in the room, he said, how many of you guys, there was 3,000 people at the conference. And he said, how many of you guys attend religious services weekly? And 95% of the hands in the room went up. Now, this was interesting because we were not, the people on the advisory board were responsible for inviting people. We were told, invite the people who are not just critiquing the current systems that are failing us. Invite the people that are building the parallel polis, building the institutions that are actually doing it right. And so that's who we invited. We invited the people that were standing for the good, true, and beautiful, who were trying to create culture that was going to tell a better story. But it's interesting because we were not told, go invite religious people. Right. Go get the Christians, go get the Jews. We just invited the people that were doing the good. We invited the people that were creating those parallel positive societies. And it just so happened that 95% of them were Christians and Jews. Now, why is that? It's because there is something about the biblical worldview that allows you to create those parallel societies that are the alternative to the rot and the destruction that is being advanced by the progressive worldview. There is something about this Christian foundation that allows you to pull together, 19 different experts on a variety of different topics and frame it as a matter of child protection. It's not by accident that Christians have their hands in this kind of work. It actually is an extension, a true extension of our true religion.
Yeah. Well, you said you guys were asked to pull together institutions that were doing it right. 95% of the hands went up. And one thing that flagged me from your book was the Catholic social services. This was in the religious liberty chapter. And this was a few days ago already that I read this part, so it's already going to be fuzzy for me, but it was crazy to read about the good that the Catholic social services was doing. And then the fact that they were stripped of their rights and ability to do so, which obviously immediately impacted kids. So can you talk to that a little bit?
It is nuts that obviously through a lot of sort of ESG, DEI priorities, even the government is now using these very selective lenses about who is allowed to offer services to arguably, maybe the preborn are the only ones that are more vulnerable. But once you get into like foster care, those kids, if there is ever a demographic that needs champions and protectors, it is foster kids. It is kids whose parents have relinquished or have had to be taken from their parents. And it is Christians historically who have started orphanages. It's Christians who have run adoption agencies. It's Christians overwhelmingly who adopt kids, 2 to 1 from the general population. And then to take these progressive priorities and say, not you. You can't participate. You can't help anymore. Why? Because you run afoul of some of our progressive priorities. It is such an injustice to kids. And there's a lot of ways that religious liberty and restricting religious liberty harms kids, mainly just like their ability to ask big questions, right? Like if you don't have conscience rights, if you don't have the ability to ask the ultimate questions, you actually limit children's ability to be fully human. I mean, like we are different from the other animals in the animal kingdom because we can have we can ask these existential questions. When you start restricting religious practice, what you're doing is you're restricting speech and you're restricting thought about the ultimate areas of life. That those restrictions have an impact on the individual child. It certainly has an impact on the society at large in terms of if a child does voice those questions or ask those kinds of things, they're looked down on. They're looked at with suspicion, right? Instead of having this incredible world of free inquiry. But then you start looking at what that does to the institutions themselves, who are built upon the idea that we should serve the most vulnerable, the most marginalized. And a lot of those organizations have been religious in nature. I mean, Catholic social services, Lutheran social services, a lot of the major adoption agencies out there have been fueled by Christians, because there is something about our worldview that says we have a disproportionate burden to help the least of these. And now, unfortunately, through a lot of the erosions of protections around religious liberty, many of those organizations are being curtailed in terms of how they can serve kids. It's absolutely nuts.
While I believe the doctor's office can have its time and place, I am so thankful for the ways that I have learned to take care of my family's health at home, and for the tools that I have in my toolbox, as I call it, to help care for my family when they're sick. One of those tools that I've put in my family's toolbox is homeopathy, and one of the brands that we trust is Remedy Collective. We have their first aid kit, which has a guide with a list of problems that I can go to decide what remedy I want to use. And the first aid kit has just a bunch of remedies that cover almost all of the problems that we will encounter. It's been so helpful for our family to have. If you're interested in learning more about homeopathy and possibly getting a first aid kit for you and your family, go to remedycollective.com/boomclappodcast and use the code boomclap to save 10% on your order.
Rita, I am very curious to hear what your favorite chapter was, if there was one that stood out to you.
All right. So I don't know. All the chapters were very good. And we talked about ESG already. That is a passion topic of mine. I think, Cecily, we did stakeholder economics. We did an episode in 2021. Yeah. And I don't want to say it went over like a lead balloon. People listen, but it wasn't one that people are like, oh, that's super interesting. So like, I just really love those off the beaten path topics that are really on the beaten path. People just don't know about. But as far as topics that are very much discussed in culture, I like the masculinity chapter because I felt like it was discussed in a bit different way. I really enjoyed that. And then the femininity chapter. I don't know why I'm struggling to say femininity, but it's like not rolling off my tongue today. But anyways, I really enjoyed that as well. And I was sitting there, my daughters were sitting there doing something as I was reading on my laptop, and I was holding my baby boy and nursing him. And I'm just like sitting there thinking like, I am so thankful I get to be home with him. Like I am so thankful. And I did still work a little bit when the girls were little, but it's just like, that was beaten into us. And I sat there thinking not only how I'm thankful to be home with him, but how thankful I am to be raising kids right now, not 10 years ago, not 15 years ago, you know, but like right now, having my kids in this day and age when we're having these conversations, because I think there are a lot of people talking about how the world is right now. And like saying, I don't want to have kids. I'm scared to have kids with the way the world is. But I think like we're kind of in a sweet spot in the blessing of we get to raise our kids in a time when these conversations are being had and we're getting pushed back to the way things should be.
So I agree with that. I totally agree with that. You know, our previous book that you guys talked about with us was called Raising Conservative Kids in a Woke City. And it was just, how do you instill a Christian, conservative, biblical worldview in your kids when everything is lying to you? And my kids so far, I mean, I'm like 3/4 of the way through the parenting thing. So there still is a fourth quarter where things could go awry. Right. But for now, like my kids, strong, confident, grounded, but they've learned also not to just slash and burn every time they go out. Like they've learned to wield their weapons appropriately and not unnecessarily trigger. And I'll talk to parents who have kids who are like 20 and 30 who fell away or did reject their beliefs. And they'll say, oh, if only I had known this when my kids were young. And I'm like, you know what? It was a different world. You were parenting in a different world. You were parenting in a world where the dangers were not as obvious, where the lies were not as overt, where it did look like the world at large might have a valuable alternative to the Christian worldview. The contrast was not as stark. And so right now, like with where we're parenting, if we can get to our kids, if we can train them well, like the insanity of the left does the work for us. I mean, like I don't have to go out and talk to my kids about the harms of, you know, all these different sexual identities. They are watching their friends try on a variety of different sexual identities, and they're watching their friends believe all these kinds of lies about Western civilization. They are seeing how depressed and unhappy they are. They're seeing the levels of anxiety because they are dialing into voices and influencers who are not connected to reality. I don't have to tell them about how crazy the world is. They see it. And so if we can, you know, anyway, it's just a different time to be a parent. And honestly, I think that like 20 years ago, if I was parenting, I'd be like, actually, there's a lot of hard stuff out in the world. But I think that back then, I mean, kids are like, but it's so scientific and it's so enlightened and it's so tolerant. And I mean, that's the way for freedom. And now it's like, nope, that's slavery.
Yeah. It is.
That's irrationality. And we don't have to make the case to our kids. I will say about the masculinity and femininity chapters, I mean, like when I say I got the best people, I got the best people. The masculinity chapter was written by the president of Promise Keepers. You know, like
it was very well done.
They've been doing masculinity well for a long time. And the femininity chapter was written by Peachy Keenan, who wrote Domestic Extremist, who might be my favorite follow on Twitter. She is so brilliant, so cutting, so witty. And she's all about motherhood. She's all about deconstructing the lies that we have been telling young women for a generation. Like, you'll be happier if you leave your 6-month-old in daycare and go back to your career because that's where real fulfillment is. So I just really appreciate, I mean, I'm still amazed that these wonderful, smart people took their area of expertise and filtered it through my lens. And, you know, I think it's great for a lot of reasons, but mainly like you get exposed to some of the best thinkers on these topics.
Yeah, it was like really well done. And Peachy Keenan, I mean, what a fantastic name.
Well, it's a pseudonym.
Yeah. Okay, I was thinking it must be. I'm like...
She lives in a very deep blue area, and she's a counterculturalist, but she's been able to get a lot done under that pseudonym.
That's what I was going to say. Yeah. I think the fact that she is like the anonymity lets her maybe be a little more cutting because you don't have that like personal backlash. I don't know. Not that maybe she's scared of that, but I don't know. I think I would maybe speak a little differently, not necessarily for fear of what anybody thinks of me, but just maybe, I don't know. I don't know really how to, I think you guys understand like what I'm saying.
Oh, absolutely. When we, at Them Before Us, when we gather the stories of children of divorce or children with same-sex parents or children created through sperm or egg donation or surrogacy, I actually encourage people to use a pseudonym, because otherwise they'll temper parts of their story because they're still trying to have a relationship with their stepmom who, favors her own kids, but she's the one that determines the invites at Thanksgiving. So it's like, I need honesty from you. I need you to give me the brutal, raw truth. And the people that don't use pseudonyms are the people whose parents have died. Those are the only ones that feel like they can speak freely.
Yeah. And I will say, just getting back to the masculinity and femininity, that is tough. There's a lot of N's and I's.
Yeah.
Getting back to that for a second, I felt, even though I feel like I've been extremely blessed in order to be able to just step into who I am as a person in my personal and professional life, even so, reading those chapters just gave me this feeling of peace, right? And what a contrast to the other side where it's like, find your identity, find who you are, search yourself out. And then on this side where it's like, well, actually, if we just focus on the truth, what an immense amount of peace. Again, it's the fruit of the ideas that is the evidence, as long as people will allow themselves to examine that, right?
Yeah. And it is freedom. It is freedom to say, I don't have to be at war with my body if I'm a woman. I mean, like, talk about bondage. To believe that a child that you conceive that might be wrongly timed is your enemy. I mean, or that you as a man, if you inherently want to go out and conquer and fight, that you're toxic to do it, rather than understanding that that's actually something so critical and needed in society, is for you to take that aggressiveness and channel it towards the very, very real enemies of the world, whether that is, people that would come at your wife or kids, or people that are seeking to victimize kids. I mean, like, take your strength and use it. Yeah. And so, like, that is the nice thing about this pro-child lens, is it's completely grounded in reality, and you can discern the truth about all these different topics, especially, like, I would say, especially the cultural topics about race, about gender, about masculinity, femininity, life, marriage, family. Like, you start with the child, you advance ideas that are pro-child, you will get the right answer to life, masculinity, femininity, family, race, gender. Turns out you can get them on economic and national issues too.
Yeah, so true. Okay, and we're at an hour, so we will try to start wrapping it up for you. I know you've still got to fly somewhere today. So, but let's talk to policing for a minute, just because it flowed naturally from that conversation on masculinity, because policing cuts, police funding cuts. And basically, because of that whole essentially toxic masculinity, even though there are wonderful women police officers as well, but they frame it all under that toxic masculinity umbrella, right? So we do funding cuts there, but then what the police would normally keep in check, that's true toxic masculinity, right? With all the crime and horrible things. So let's talk about that for a second, because that's another chapter that I was like, not that I looked at it and thought, oh, I don't want to read that. It was just like another chapter. And then I read it and I was like, yes, you know?
Well, that's a great connection that I actually had not really made before. So you guys are like my third interview I've done on this book. So like, thanks for letting me work it out. I really appreciate it. I'm like, ooh, Cliff Notes. I'm going to use that. Ooh, I do need to like connect policing and masculinity in the future. But the masculinity chapter begins with a story of Ken Harrison, the author, who was an LA police officer, going and confronting a child rapist, and that it really did take physical strength. I mean, they got into a skirmish, wrestled each other to the ground, and then even the two police officers were in a scuttle because one of them just wanted to kill that boy dead.
I've got goosebumps thinking about that story again.
Yeah. And it's like, but yeah, a female police officer going in and confronting the child rapist could have turned out really differently. The policing chapter was written by Ari Hoffman, who is a local journalist here in Seattle. And I asked him to write the chapter because Seattle is the test case. Seattle is the place where we've actually applied a lot of the anti-policing policies, and it has not gone well. So he begins with the story of a little girl who was struck by a driver who had a criminal record, who the police were not allowed to pursue because we have decided that police chases, are a problem. And I will tell you the other thing that sort of ties all these different issues together is we get these policies wrong because we get the victim wrong. Like if you think that it's, it's the immigrant who is the victim rather than, this sort of caricature of the immigrant that we have in our brain coming through. Oh, they're the victim. Therefore, we need to open up our entire nation, fund social services for them, give them free housing. Like, no, the real victims are children of our immigration policy. And so we are constantly through this book reframing the victim. And the policing chapter obviously frames criminals as victims. I mean, the reason why we got policing wrong is because we think that the people who are getting these sentences or are being incarcerated or are being leveled with these penalties or whatever, that they're the victims. And so whoever you decide is the victim, that's who determines the policy. So unfortunately in Seattle, we have said, people that end up in jail, they're the victims. Well, what happens then? You end things like police chases, you reduce the number of police. And what happens? Like wait times for responses go up and criminals go free and those criminals kill kids. And so that's his first story is, and it's one of dozens and dozens of children who were killed by people that 10, 15 years ago would have been locked up. And those little girls would have still been walking home happily, but they're not because we got policing wrong.
It's so true. It was hard to argue. That's
powerful.
Yeah. And I didn't even want to argue it when I was reading the chapter, because I believed that going into it. But then reading that chapter, it was just like solidified. And man, I felt that deeply. Like it's hard not to get angry when it's just injustice. Absolutely. Yes. When we reframe the victims like that and then make policy changes based on that, it's total injustice.
Yeah. That's right. And it's worth getting angry about, and then it's worth taking action over.
Absolutely.
Rita, on the policing topic, have you heard about the Sonia Massey case? I'm sure you have.
I don't know.
I haven't.
Okay, so there was this woman. It's local to us, but it's been making national news for several weeks now.
Oh, yeah.
She was a Black woman shot by a police officer in her home. I've seen the video. They've released the video. It was obviously unless there's something missing that we're seeing, which is possible, but I don't think there is. It was obvious, awful. He shot her in the head. She was holding a pot of water, a boiling pot of water. And very interestingly, she said, "I rebuke you in the name of Jesus." Literally, that was the last thing she said before he shot her.
Yeah, but it went from calm to
totally
escalated.
Wrong.
Yeah.
Totally wrong. I can't find any way that this will ever be framed as he did not do something wrong. He has a history of bad behavior as a policeman as well. But my point is, this was, in my mind, murder. Wrong. But I can't remember the attorney's name. He's a high profile attorney. He gets on all of these cases where there's police, a shooting against a, criminal or otherwise. But they're framing it very much as you need to get out and vote because of this, this racism will not stand, yada, yada. And I just want to say, we don't have to have this view that police are always in the right to understand that they can do something wrong, but that does not mean police as a rule, entirely are wrong, and that it is a voting issue or a racism issue. This, in my mind, looks like just very much a bad cop situation.
And perhaps spiritual as well, right? It's just very...
that's what I messaged you about. I'm I feel like this is very odd that she said this and he immediately shot her in the face. And
did you say, was she Black?
Yeah.
Yes.
Oh my gosh.
She had called them to the house because she thought somebody was outside doing something, and then somehow they ended up in her house, and then they had her go check a pot of boiling water. He's like, I don't want there to be a fire. It was just, I'm just bringing it up because it's a very current issue that's making national news right now, and it's being used to promote people to vote a certain way based on policing and race alone.
Well, and I will say that is obviously that's horrible. And the good news is we actually have systems in place to hold officers accountable. But I will say that is another sort of feature of how the left will push their progressive agenda. They will take what I've heard called and referred to as edge cases, right? Those things that are the exceptions to the norm. And then they will frame policy around the edge cases. So things like rape and incest. You know, they're like, oh, rape and incest, right? It's the one sort of morally unclear area of abortion. And then they will push abortion policy up until birth based on the possibility that, you know, less than 1% of rape and incest cases comes to the fore. You know, it's the same thing with, well, I mean, like every issue.
That's
but
a really good way of putting
it.
We've
seen this, right? We've seen times of bad police behavior caught on tape. You can't get out of it. And then you take that exception, right? That edge case. And then you say all cops are bad, defund everybody, put social workers in place instead. A social worker would never have done this kind of thing. And so we do need to be aware of, you know what? There are areas where there's challenging issues and edge cases that need to be addressed. But when you make policy based on those edge cases, it's kids that are going to be victimized every time.
Yeah, that's a really good point. Edge cases. That's a good way of stating that. Yeah. So
really good.
All right. So there's just
go ahead,
Cecily.
No, I was going to say, is there anything else major that you want to cover? So
not major, like not any major topics, but there are a few phrases I want to pull out. I think it was in Peachy Keenan's chapter. She said, "In late Empire America," and I'm like, oh man, I'm totally using that. It was so good.
She's so good.
And so bad at the same time.
The brains, the writing skills. That's why I say she's my favorite follow on Twitter. I mean, like it's just fire take after fire take. And I'll say, God, why couldn't I write like that? You're not Peachy Keenan, honey. But I'm like, why can't I do that? But nobody can do that. Only Peachy can do it.
Super gifted.
Yeah. And then in the ESG chapter, one of the quotes I pulled out was, "You do not need to change a law to change culture." And it's like, because they're making all these cultural changes without even one law happening. So very good. And then I think it was the immigration chapter, something about just the word unserious. Like this is unserious. Like the politics that are happening are unserious. I'm like, that is the best word to describe everything happening right now. It just seems so unserious. Like Biden is in office and like nobody's heard from him in weeks. Like this is very unserious that we have somebody with some kind of neurological disorder running our country. Quote, in quotes, running. But you know what I mean? Unserious.
Agree. The immigration chapter maybe is my favorite. Partially because I respect Laura Reese, who wrote it so much, because she's been doing this for decades. I mean, I was like, can you do this? And she's like, yeah. And I'm like, can you do it according to this rubric? She's like, yeah. And I'm like, can you give it to me in 4 weeks? She's like, yeah. And it comes back. And like, you know, when you're editing a book, there's different levels of need in terms of like editing and shaping. Girl didn't need anything.
Wow.
She's just a legit professional. She's this crazy hybrid of expert and incredible writer. And I was really captivated by her chapter.
Oh, yeah.
You know, she tells the story of a girl who's being trafficked across the border, and she's reunited with family, but really it's just a situation where she's going to be sexually assaulted and used as domestic labor, which is emblematic of how so many of these unaccompanied minors have been treated. I mean, like we have had, anyway, immigration policy is not just bad for US kids, which it is bad for the immigrant kids themselves.
Yes.
The way that we are conducting or lack of conducting what's happening at the border, it is subjecting kids to some of the worst, most graphic, most violent, enduring abuses that any kid can face. It's absolutely inhumane.
Yeah, well, that's what I was thinking of when you were talking earlier about how the book is constantly reframing the victim. I feel like in the case of immigration and these children coming from other countries, we've always thought of them as the victim, but they're a victim, so let them come, right? Yeah. That's been the mentality. with forgetting the fact that so many of them are victims that become further victimized just in a brand new way, which is disgusting.
And we're encouraging it. Like our policies are literally encouraging kids to be subjected to, I mean, human rights abuses is the only way to put it. It is, it's obscene the way these kids are. I mean, death, rape, smuggling, domestic servitude. And they disappear. They disappear into the ether. We don't know what happens to them. A lot of them are lost forever. I mean, obviously they're going to be trafficked, not just by the coyotes across the border, but then trafficked into the underworld here. And it's a crime. It's a crime against children.
Absolutely. Yep. Okay. I definitely have so much more written down, but I feel like we need to let you go. But it was just
read the book.
So good. Read the book, you guys. It was so well done. Like Katy put together, like you said at the beginning, this excellent rubric that all the writers followed. Even like, I figured you must have sent them a rubric. That's how good it was, because it was like, I could see these threads being, I would be like, oh, and there's how it affects the children. Like I could see the threads in every single chapter. It was just incredible. So get it. Katy.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks for taking the time to read it and for your feedback. I will say it's such a massive cheat. It's a cheat for those of us that care about all of this, but don't know what we think about some of it. And so you get a very, very concentrated, write-up of energy. Like what should I think about energy? Why does energy matter? Like things that I'm not an expert on at all, but I can like always grab it and like, it's like 10 pages on energy, so you can, boom, just get it, what you need to know. You hear somebody talking about climate alarmism, boom, go to the environment chapter and like, take a look at, real stewardship of the environment, what that really looks like. For me, I mean, like I've read it 7 times through the editing process. I still am pulling it up and going, oh yeah, what are the ways that taxes harm kids and the bad like tax policies and the lies about taxes? Because I mean, Grover's like, here's 8 lies about taxes. I'm like, oh, those are really helpful.
Yeah, totally.
Okay, so this is a question I have just to end here. Or if you have something else, Cecily, fine. I don't mean like this is a hard stop, but sorry, that came off funny. But anyway, as I was reading, I was wondering, is this a book hard for you to go on podcasts and things and talk about since you didn't write everything yourself? Like, is it hard?
Yes.
Like, I feel like it's mentally got to be straining.
Oh yeah.
Well, and it's like, so just between like you and me and your whatever tens of thousands of listeners, I can go on podcasts and talk all the time about them before us stuff because boom, I know it all. But I'm like, I have to go represent Neil Chatterjee on energy. So I have got like a cheat on my phone, like where I've got all of the majors, like, I can, oh yeah, that's right. He said this. And I can give the basics, but what I'd love is for you guys to interview Neil Chatterjee on energy at some point. I mean, the boy is, like his bio is so beefy. Like he just knows what he's talking about. I can only give a very shallow representation, but I can repeat what he said. Right. And you can bank on what he said. So it is a different kind of preparation in terms of like going on and pitching the book. I can pitch the whole philosophy. I can talk about why we need it. I can tell you like what the commonality, the edge cases, how children are victimized. Like I can tell you why this needs to be the way that conservatives talk. I can tell you that prioritizing the future is actually the thing that connects all the different, the 3 legs of the conservative stool. I am not the right person to like get into the weeds about like religious liberty, but thankfully I found the girl who can do exactly that for you,
Yeah, really good.
Well, you did a great job. I just feel like it'd be like studying before you come on the podcast every time. So you're probably
I'll be better at it a lot.
Oh my goodness, you're fantastic. And I feel like this book, like you said, it is that reference that'll stick with you. It's almost like a textbook, except written in such an engaging way and with stories. Like I always think like we homeschool in the way I want to teach my kids, even though I often fail, because it makes the most sense to me to teach them through story, right? And these are true stories, but that's the best kind of story is these true stories. And that's how they retain what they're learning. And that's what I think everyone's going to get when they read this book is like this information that you can actually retain because it's told through real life lived experience. It's amazing. So I think not to put the hard stop on it, like Rita said, but I think a really great way to end is one thing I forgot to talk about with the ESG. We defined, environmental, social governance. But he had talked about, he or she, now I forget who was the author of the ESG chapter, sorry.
Yeah, Justin, he.
Okay, yeah. So he talked about a different kind of ESG, which is equality, safety, and governance, but not government governance, parental governance. So I think that's a great way to wrap it up. Like that's because another way to ask this question would be like, how do we be pro-child? How do we now move forward and do this? But I think he sums it up really well.
Oh, agree. Yeah, I love that. Like ESG, it is a thing. It does matter, but it's not equity. It's equality, real equality, merit-based equality, tearing down barriers, not stacking the deck in favor of one group or another. That's real equality. That's really what our nation was founded on. Maybe didn't deliver and execute perfectly throughout our history, but that is the foundational principle we need to be aiming at. Safety, like they need safety. They need safety from things like pornography. They need safety from debt that is going to like crowd out their ability to make decisions for their own future, right? They do need safety from criminals. We need to police the streets. They need the real kind of safety. And then governance. They need to be governed by their parents. Everybody else needs to get out. Get out. Children don't belong to the state. They don't belong to the schools. They don't belong to the doctors. They belong to their parents, right? And as we talk about in the family chapter, their parents are statistically the most connected to, invested in, and protective of them. They need that kind of governance. You get that ESG right for kids, you get it all.
That's right. I totally agree. Katy, can we pre-order the book already? And where should we find you?
Okay, you can totally pre-order it. It's going to be out September 24th. It's already been, amazes me, #1 in new release for both human rights and cultural policy, which is incredible because I haven't done a whole lot of talking about it yet, but I do feel like it's kind of the book that we need right now. So Amazon obviously carries it, Barnes & Noble, all the places where you get books. Pre-order it for you. Get a copy to your local rep too, especially if they are conservative. It is the cheat. I mean, it's the cheat for political leaders, especially conservatives, because you can say, look, I can't raise the debt ceiling. I'm the pro-child candidate. Oh, I have to pass these age verification laws. I'm the pro-child candidate. Well, I'm not going to like pass the commercial surrogacy. You know me, I'm the pro-child candidate. I mean, I just stand for kids. You can still do and should continue to do all of the conservative priorities. You just get to do it in the name of protecting children because you are protecting children. So get a copy for yourself so you can understand all the different issues, both in the voting booth and at the Thanksgiving table, but also like get it for the people that represent you in government so they can start to represent kids.
Great point. All right. And you're on Instagram and all of these things at Them Before Us, right?
We are. I think Instagram is them_before_us. Yeah. I'm on Twitter, which is kind of the main place that I live. Advo_Katy. I probably need to get off more often, but I can't stop because Peachy's on there and I can't stop. So yeah, there's we're on all the socials and you guys should be there too.
That's awesome. Well, thank you so much, Katy. We really appreciate this conversation.
Yeah. Thanks so much, ladies. So good to see you again.
Okay. What an incredible conversation that was. As we said in the intro, this episode really began with a boom and a clap that was just sustained throughout the whole thing. We love talking with her. She's just such a smart, articulate person and supportive of what we do here, which is amazing. She's not just a guest that comes and talks for a little bit and leaves us. She's invested in what we do. And we really appreciate that about her. And we appreciate about our listeners that oh my goodness, let's just try this again. We appreciate that about her. And we appreciate that about our listeners that continue to come back week after week to hear the conversation and form this relationship with us. It's an incredible thing. So if that's you, thank you so much. Please don't forget to leave us a rating or a review. Those mean a lot to us and they go a long way towards helping us grow the podcast. As we said in the beginning, we have an episode next week coming up with just Rita and I. We're going to talk about homeschooling and a whole bunch of other things. You know how these conversations go. We start somewhere and end somewhere completely different and end up in a whole bunch of places along the way. I love these conversations. They're so fun for us, and I think for you guys too. And then at the end of the month, we're having an excellent conversation with Joey Odom about phone use, habit formation, and how this impacts our relationships. So another excellent episode. This month was chock full of really good things, and we're so excited that we get to bring that to you. So thank you for listening to the Boom Clap podcast, where culture and conviction collide.